Hey, you guys. My name is Merina Hansen. I'm president of Move Nevada Forward. I'm going to be moderating this little town hall tonight. And I'm just going to get the introductions and the housekeeping stuff out of the way quickly, and we can get on to listen to our speakers, because I know that's why we're here. Like I said, I am from Move Nevada Forward. We are local nonprofit that we are committed to promoting data-driven policies to benefit Nevadans and the rest of America also. I want to introduce Key on background. He's our wizard of tech, and he's a co-founder and director of Move Nevada Forward also. Next that I want to introduce just real quick is Joanne Leovi. She's not going to be doing any speaking tonight, but she is the chapter leader for Citizens Climate Lobby Las Vegas, and she was integral in getting this little event put together. So an introduction and a thank you to her. We're going to move on to the introduction of our speakers. Our first speaker is going to be Mariah Birnbaum, and she is a Las Vegan. She's a local, and she's a volunteer with the Citizens Climate Lobby Las Vegas chapter. And then she's going to hand it off over to Max Ghenis. He is the CEO at PolicyEngine. He's also the president of the UBI Center, and he is a volunteer state coordinator. Is that right? At Citizens Climate Lobby California chapter. So that's, I think, all I want to do is for the introduction. Most of this stuff, I think at this point, we're all pretty familiar with, like the Zoom rules of the etiquette, but I want to do some housekeeping. I encourage you guys to participate in the chat. I'm going to be mostly chatting with you guys, and and probably have my own questions for our speakers. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We are going to have a dedicated question and answer period after both Mariah and Max have spoken. They're kind of a part one, part two when it comes to speaking about the EICDA, which is HR, what is it, 2307. So if we don't have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Mariah.
Thank you. Super glad to be here. Thank you everyone for coming. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see that okay? Yep, okay. So today we're talking about the case for a carbon fee and dividend, in particular the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, and how this policy fits into the guaranteed income movement as a small form of universal basic income. Both Max and I are volunteers with Citizens Climate Lobby. Max is, as Marina said, is a state coordinator in California, and I'm a fairly new member of the Las Vegas chapter. So a little bit about CCL. Citizens Climate Lobby is a nonprofit, nonpartisan grassroots advocacy organization focused on national policies to address climate change. And the organization has two major goals. Number one is to solve climate change, and number two is to empower citizens to do exactly that. CCL is relationship driven, and we build consensus by developing respectful relationships. So before we talk about carbon fee and dividend, I want to talk briefly about how we got into this mess that is global warming. Global temperatures have been rising at an accelerating rate since the 1800s, around the time that human beings really ramped up the burning of fossil fuels. When we burn fossil fuels like coal, gas, and oil, carbon dioxide, along with other greenhouse gases, is emitted into the atmosphere. CO2, which is the primary greenhouse gas emitted through human activities, tends to stick around in the atmosphere for a long time. We're talking hundreds of years. The reason that excess greenhouse gases are so problematic is not only because of how long they stick around, but also because of their tendency to trap heat. Normally, when sunlight reaches the earth, some of it hits the earth and becomes heat, and some of it is reflected away. Greenhouse gases like CO2 trap more heat in our atmosphere, ultimately causing the earth to warm over time. The more CO2 that accumulates, the faster the earth warms. So the earth is warming. Most people acknowledge this fact. But as we know, not everyone has always been in agreement as to what or who is causing climate change. But today, the scientific consensus on global warming is very clear. 97% of climate scientists agree that global warming is real. It's caused by increased greenhouse gases, and that human activity is causing almost all the increase. Okay, so humans have altered their environment, nothing new there, but is climate change really that bad? The short answer is, yeah, it's pretty bad. One of the most recent reports released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, in February outlines some of the potential short-term and long-term impacts of continued emissions and/or unmitigated climate change. This includes things like intensification of droughts and heat waves, something familiar to us here in Las Vegas. According to a 2019 research brief by Climate Central, Las Vegas is the fastest warming city in the United States. Since 1970, the average temperature has increased by 5.76 degrees Fahrenheit. On top of that, we are also in the middle of a 22-year mega drought, and yes, that is the technical term, which researchers have found has been significantly exacerbated by human-caused climate change. Other impacts of climate change include more extreme weather events like wildfires, floods, and storms, rising sea levels, which can cause coastal flooding and damage to infrastructure, biodiversity loss like higher extinction rates for animals and plant species across the board, ocean acidification, in which carbon dioxide is absorbed by the ocean, decreases pH levels, and can disrupt entire marine ecosystems and fishing industries, diminished water quality and availability, particularly in areas that are already vulnerable, reduced crop yields and food productivity, which can drive up food prices, and displacement and involuntary migration in the areas hardest hit by warming or extreme weather events. So, having heard all of that, depressing information on a Friday evening, one might wonder if we even can solve the climate crisis. And to prevent some of the most severe impacts of climate change, scientists have said that we need to limit the amount of warming to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius. If you've been reading or listening to the news lately, you know that there's been a lot of buzz about the most recent IPCC report released earlier this month that examines developments in emission reduction and mitigation efforts and assesses the impact of national climate pledges. According to an IPCC press release about that report, without immediate and deep emissions reductions across all sectors, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is beyond reach. Needless to say, there's a lot of discouraging news out there about climate change, and it's all too easy to get swept up in a wave of climate doom. That sense of helplessness, anxiety, and even grief can be overwhelming. And all too often, it leads us to shut down because the problem feels too big or it feels like a lost cause. For others, the looming threat of climate change is still too abstract to feel real, either because it pales in comparison to here and now problems like, how am I going to pay rent this month? Or because we haven't felt the worst impacts ourselves yet. Either way, if you suffer from climate anxiety or climate apathy, or both, like I sometimes do, it's crucial to remember two things. Number one, the antidote to climate anxiety and climate apathy is climate action. And number two, we already have many of the tools and resources we need to reduce our carbon emissions. We just need the political will and the right policies to make it happen. So we're not just here today to beat you over the head with how serious climate change is. We're also here to talk about real, feasible solutions. With that in mind, the cornerstone of Citizens Climate Lobby is the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, also known as HR 2307 or the EICDA. In the next few slides, I'm going to give you just a brief overview of that policy. So what is a carbon fee and dividend? This policy is a kind of carbon pricing in which a steadily rising fee is applied wherever fossil fuels enter the economy. The carbon pricing fee is based on the metric tons of carbon dioxide the fuel generates, and it is assessed at the earliest point of sale into the economy. as close as possible to the well, mine, or port. 100% of the revenues from this carbon fee are then returned directly to households in a monthly dividend check. It can also be thought of or referred to as a revenue neutral carbon tax. So, momentum for climate change is building in Congress, particularly when it comes to price on carbon. Between 2019 and 2021, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act and 4 other carbon pricing bills have been introduced into Congress. The most recent iteration of EICDA was reintroduced as HR 2307 in 2021, and it currently has 96 sponsors in the House, including Nevada Zone Representative Dina Titus. Here's how this policy works. An initial fee of $15 per metric ton is imposed on the CO2 equivalent emissions of fossil fuels. This fee then escalates by $10 per metric ton each year. Like I said, 100% of the net fees are held in a carbon fees trust fund and returned directly in equal shares to individuals and households as a monthly dividend to spend however they see fit. In addition, half shares are allocated for each child under the age of 19. Program administrative costs are paid from the fees collected, it's about 2%, and the government does not keep any of the money from the carbon fee. Under this policy, about 2/3 of Americans will receive more in dividends than they will pay in higher prices, with low-income households typically benefiting the most because of their lower carbon footprint. In total, 95% of low and middle wealth Americans would come out ahead or essentially break even. Another component of carbon fee and dividend is a carbon border adjustment that will protect trade competitiveness. The adjustment would be imposed on covered fuels and emissions intensive trade exposed, or EITE, goods that cross our border in either direction. These goods include products like steel, aluminum, cement, glass, certain chemicals, and some agricultural products. Goods that fall under this EITE classification and are imported from a country that does not have a carbon price equivalent to ours will have to pay a surcharge to make up the difference. Conversely, an American-made EITE product exported to any country will get a refund for the carbon fee paid in the US. This incentivizes American companies not to move their companies abroad and their CO2 pollution abroad. So let's talk about some benefits. There are plenty of benefits to the carbon fee and dividend. The big 4 we'll talk about today are reducing our carbon emissions to net zero by 2050, which is in line with IPCC's recommendations, creating affordable clean energy and clean energy jobs, improving our health by reducing air pollution, and putting money in ordinary Americans' pockets. So first things first, let's talk about emissions reductions under the Energy Innovation Act as compared to some other pathways. IPCC has issued guidelines for how quickly the world must reduce emissions to stay below the 2 degrees Celsius and 1.5 degrees Celsius thresholds to minimize climate change. Under a business as usual scenario, if nothing changes, US emissions are forecasted to remain relatively flat. The estimated policy impact of, say, the Clean Electricity Payment Program would see an initial decrease in emissions, but not quickly enough. EICDA would reduce America's carbon pollution by 50% from 2005 levels by 2030, putting us on track to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Not only will it help us keep our international commitments, but the policy would keep emissions low enough to stay within that 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming. Let's see, so today the environmental and health harms of fossil fuels cost $800 million per year. When you factor in the societal costs of burning fossil fuels, their affordability starts to look, well, a lot less affordable. A carbon fee and dividend will spur the adoption of clean energy. America leads the world with technology innovation, and with this policy, the government sets the direction and businesses respond in order to provide abundant, affordable, and reliable clean energy and create new jobs. Burning fossil fuels harms our health directly by generating pollutants and indirectly through the release of greenhouse gases. Today, 350,000 lives are lost each year to air pollution, with many of the hardest hit being low-income people. Cutting carbon emissions through a carbon fee and dividend could save 4.5 million American lives over the next 50 years. And finally, A carbon fee and dividend would serve as a small form of universal basic income. Total yearly dividends would start off small and increase over time as the price of carbon increases. In the first year, the carbon dividend will be about $16 to $24 per month per adult. If you're curious how much your monthly dividend would be under EICDA, we will drop a link in the chat to the personal carbon dividend calculator. And you can kind of adjust that based on your lifestyle as well. The guaranteed monthly payment could be easily set up using already existing US Treasury infrastructure, allowing people to receive a monthly direct deposit, paper check, or have their dividend added to an existing government issued debit card. And as Max will go on to explain, even a small monthly guaranteed dividend can have a significant impact on reducing poverty and deep poverty. And with that, I will pass it over to Max.
Awesome. Thank you, Mariah. And great to be here with you all. I'm really looking forward to sharing some of our research at the UBI Center and PolicyEngine on carbon dividends, and also just giving a bit of a background on the connection between those two policies, between carbon dividends and UBI, as Mariah just described. Especially glad to be here because Move Nevada Forward has been such a leader in the UBI space in terms of endorsing the policy. So with that, I will, let's see, I think I'll share my screen. Okay, here we are. Can you all see my slides all right? Here. Okay. So yeah, what I'll talk about is just following up on that carbon dividends, UBI, and poverty, and sort of the link between all those. And I've been involved in this conversation through the UBI Center think tank, PolicyEngine, which is a nonprofit that computes the impact of public policies. Oh, and I forgot, I was going to drop the link to the slides in the chat if you'd like to follow along. So I just did that. And also through CCL itself. So I've been a member of CCL since 2019 or so, 2018, and then I became a group leader, and now I'm helping other group leaders across California be more effective as a state coordinator. So I'll start by talking about some of the broad connection between carbon dividends and the UBI, then move on to some of our research on carbon dividends and poverty through the UBI Center, and then give you a brief tour of PolicyEngine UK. I know we're in the US, of course, but you know, we've done some research in the UK that we're going to translate over to the US context this year, hopefully, both on the carbon dividend side and a whole host of other kinds of UBI style policies I think will interest you all. So as Mariah mentioned, you know, this is a really effective climate policy. It gets us on track to have our emissions by 2030, gets us on track to get to net zero by 2050. I also want to showcase this one study which just came out last week from the Center Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. They worked with a group called Energy Innovation to estimate how much emissions reduction you would get from a suite of policies. So whether that's a carbon tax or the Build Back Better Act or sort of a combination between those. And it's not exactly on this chart, but some follow-up analysis from them showed that even a $20 per ton carbon tax that only increases 1% per year. So this is actually less aggressive than the Energy Innovation Act. If you look at how much cumulative emissions through 2030 that reduces, it's more effective than the entire Build Back Better Act by itself. So, and then if you pair it with the Build Back Better Act or make it a more aggressive carbon tax, you can have even more of an effect. But it's also really connected to UBI. It is the only feasible legislation in Congress for permanent universal monthly checks. And you know, certainly it's not to the size of UBI that some other ideas like the freedom dividend have been in the past, but it's universal, it's fully funded, and it's really in Congress. It has, you know, almost 100 co-sponsors now. So I think this is just a major opportunity. And if you can actually compare it to some of these other ideas that have been out there. So Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, this goes to all age groups. It has no income limit, no lottery, it's monthly. And this is actually unique among a variety of cash transfer policies. So there's another carbon pricing bill in Congress called the Save Our Future Act which is a great bill, but it is means-tested. It's not monthly, it goes out quarterly. The child tax credit expansion, of course, that's only for kids, and it is means-tested as well. The basic income for New York City, also there is an income limit there. All the guaranteed income pilots, those have income limits, and they have lotteries associated with them. So, if you're looking for a bill that checks all the boxes, this is your bill. And the dividend rises over time. So in the beginning, it wouldn't be too much. It might be about $20 per adult in that first year, but by 2035, it's going to peak. So that's when, because the carbon price increases over time, but also carbon emissions are falling. So there is sort of this bell shape here. But by the time it peaks, it's going to be almost $100 per month for every adult, and that's in current dollars. And I think that's pretty important because it creates the infrastructure for larger payments. You can imagine if we already had the infrastructure for cash assistance during the pandemic, it may have been a very different story in terms of we can just bump that up to meet the needs of the current time. And also, if you think about something like the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend and the role that that's played in the US UBI or even global UBI policy discussion, it's been really huge. You've had research from a whole bunch of economists looking at it from very different angles. And I think you would be able to see that kind of research be catalyzed by this policy as well. It also demonstrates the progressivity of UBI. I think this is a point that's often underappreciated, just the fact that giving everybody money, even if it's taxed by, funded by relatively broad-based taxes, it's going to leave the bottom people at the bottom of the income distribution better off. So this is a study from CCL itself, but it aligns with a variety of other studies, finding that in the first year, the bottom quintile would gain about $20 per month on a net basis. So they would pay more in energy costs, they pay more for other kinds of goods and services, but they would get so much more from the carbon dividend that they'd come out ahead on that basis. And you can also look sort of within different income quintiles to say, okay, that's the average effect, but actually almost everybody in that first quintile also comes out ahead. So it's not just, folks in rural America paying for the cost of this bill. It's really very broad-based in terms of its progressivity. They're actually also a lot more popular than UBI. So these are a couple of the most recent studies, polls on carbon dividends and UBI. This one was a bit of an outlier, plus 51. So 66% of folks supported a carbon dividend in 2019 from this poll, and 15% opposed it. So you're looking at 51 net favorability of that policy. On average, it's more like plus 30 or so. And then this is the most recent UBI poll as well, and finds that UBI is actually a bit underwater. So if you're looking for something that's a bit more palatable, this is also a good intro into the UBI space. Also mentioned that there are a couple links here to some a spreadsheet I've made, and also the UBI poll tracker that the UBI Center has produced. So you can look at more polls. So I mentioned before the fact that it checks a bunch more boxes compared to some of the other cash assistance policies. And that's true, but it's also just way more generous than even really big policies like the child tax credit expansion, a major focus of the UBI and broader anti-poverty movements over the past year. That would deliver about $400 billion in cash to Americans through 2025. And the Energy Innovation Act gives even more, a full 25% more cash delivered in those 5 years, plus it's permanent, or at least until we end carbon emissions, which would be amazing. It distributes $6 trillion in cash through 2050. So the CTC expansion, that would end in 2025. A bunch of these other pilots give just a tiny fraction of what those kind of policies, what this policy delivers. So that's sort of some of the background, and I want to turn now to the impact of carbon dividends on poverty. And you just saw a few of the ways that it's progressive. Low-income people come out ahead on average, high-income people come out behind mostly. And so this is a study we did at the UBI Center that doesn't quite reflect the EICDA, but it's pretty close. So one of the differences, for example, we look at giving an equal share to all Americans instead of double to adults compared to children. Also, the dividend is not taxable, so that's one thing that the EICDA does. And then there's some differences in terms of the consumer share that's borne. So these are kind of details. Overall, it's a very similar analysis. Just wanted to share those caveats. So here is the analysis. You can go to ubicenter.org/US carbon dividend and see the results there. So this is essentially a series of some interactive charts that we looked at. So just to set the stage, if you look at a carbon price of, let's say, $20 per ton, that corresponds to a $25 per month dividend that goes to every American. So by the time you're at 100, you're looking at about 125 per month. And the EICDA starts at $15 per month, per ton, rises $10 for every year that passes. And here's the TLDR chart. If you hit the carbon price of $100, which we would reach within a decade, you're cutting poverty by 10%. And it's pretty much a linear effect until then. So the higher the carbon price, the higher the dividend, the bigger the carbon or anti-poverty impact. And you can also look at the impact on what's called deep poverty. So that's the share of people who are below half the poverty line. And that's an even stronger effect. So that's about 12% by the time you hit $100. It also has some stronger effects on child poverty. So $100 again is going to actually reduce deep child poverty, which we know from a whole bunch of developmental economics, psychological literature is really predictive of long-term human development. You're cutting deep child poverty by 27%. And again, this sort of, you can drag the slider and see it's really a linear effect in terms of how it affects different age groups. And now we're talking about Nevada here. So I thought I'd zoom in, we've got a map. And again, looking at the $100 per ton carbon price, Nevada actually has slightly bigger than average poverty responses to the carbon dividend. So instead of falling 10% like it does across the country, actually falls 14%. Deep child poverty would fall instead of 27%, 29%. So you can, it's over a quarter of deep child poverty within a decade would be gone just as a result of this policy. This is a climate policy. It's not really anti-poverty policy, but it happens to have really essential anti-poverty impacts. So that's kind of the crux of the report. And from there, I wanted to share or close with some of the work we've been doing on PolicyEngine. So PolicyEngine is actually a project that started within the UBI Center to show the impacts of UBI policies, which often involve tax and benefit reforms across a whole range of different kind of reforms. And then because we already had that infrastructure, we sort of spun it off into a new nonprofit called PolicyEngine last year. PolicyEngine US is relatively new, so we don't have carbon dividends yet. But in the UK, here's sort of the app. So it lets you design a customizable policy reform. And this can involve reforms to the existing tax and benefit structure or to UBI, including a carbon tax, the Green Party we worked with over there to analyze their policy. And you can kind of fiddle with all these knobs to design your own policy, and then we'll see the impact on the UK. And there's also a personalized calculator that you can see. Okay, so the carbon tax we can design through the UBI Center side. And let's just go with let's say a 50 pound per ton carbon tax. And now we can go to the basic income section. And there's actually a button at the bottom which makes our life easier. We can just click direct surplus revenue into UBI. And this sort of calculates the budget neutral UBI. So it turns out this would be about 8 pounds per week. In the UK, they talk about things per week instead of per month. So we adapted to that cultural change. And then you hit calculate UK impact. And this is going to calculate in real time. I've never actually calculated this particular value. I go with a different carbon tax each time for fun. But we can see it's basically budget neutral. So 10 million pounds is really nothing. It's just a rounding error. Poverty falls 8%. So, that's not too different from what we see. 50 pounds, I think, is about maybe $70 or so. So you're looking at a pretty similar response. Most people, again, come out ahead, 2/3 of people. And you can actually see the poverty impact for each age group. So again, child poverty falls more. Child deep poverty falls by 22% here. So you can look by income decile. So it's very progressive, as we've seen before. We can actually look at wealth decile 2. And you can see also that more people, this is sort of a graph of for each decile, what share of people come out ahead or behind. So again, low income folks are more likely to gain significantly from the policy, and high income folks are sort of paying into the policy. And then it also shows the income inequality. So the Gini index, which is sort of a very broad-based view into income inequality, that falls about 2%. And you can see some different results as well. So that is where I will leave off, and I'm really looking forward to hearing all of your questions and continuing the conversation. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Max and Mariah. Those were excellent presentations. Like really, really, that was so awesome. Thank you so much for that. We do have a couple of questions, and everyone else, if you have more, feel free to drop them in the chat also. The first one we're starting off with is from Caesar. The second one is from Caesar also, but which legislators have come out in favor and opposed? And I know there's like 100 who have come out in favor. So we won't ask you to name every single one today, but if you could give them a little bit of insight into that.
Yeah, sure. It's really a broad coalition. I'm just looking it up. You can go to energyinnovationact.org. So everyone from some of the more centrist folks were some of the original sponsors, folks you may not have heard of because they're kind of less newsworthy maybe, but Ted Deutsch, Salud Carbajal is actually just to my north in Santa Barbara. But we also have some progressives. So I think Pramila Jayapal, yes, yeah, she's one of the newer co-sponsors, Pramila Jayapal, Donald Payne, Karen Bass, who's running for LA mayor, some real high profile folks like Ted Lieu, and who's the one who was really leading the charge on the Russia stuff a bit ago. Sarah Jacobs is in there. I'm not sure if there are people who have specifically opposed our bill, but some people do oppose carbon pricing because they believe it's a market-based solution, which isn't appropriate. Bernie Sanders sort of was one of the few legislators or candidates who opposed carbon pricing in the primary, but he's actually come out in favor of it as being part of the reconciliation bill, the Build Back Better. Apparently, it was really just Manchin who wasn't on board within the Senate. So it's definitely gaining traction. Definitely.
Okay, I'm gonna go back and forth here. So next question is from Dara. Hey, and she says, I noticed that people in low-income communities are the most likely to suffer from global warming, which is frustrating. Facts. But the first speaker mentioned that low-income communities have the lowest carbon footprint. Why is that? Is it simply they don't have yachts to power and don't travel as much? Or are there other contributing factors? That is a nice question. Thank you.
It's a very good question. And yes, part of it is they don't have the yachts, they don't travel as much. Some, lower income people don't have a car, so that lowers their footprint as well. And then you're also looking at all the carbon emissions that are baked into many of the things we buy. And in general, lower income people don't have the money to buy as many things. So I think that's kind of the basis for that. And Max, feel free to hop in if I'm missing anything there.
No, I think that's right. Even within cars, it's like they're less likely to own cars. They're more likely to have smaller cars, more fuel efficient cars when they do have cars, maybe less likely have electric vehicles, but those are still a very tiny share of total vehicles on the market. They live in smaller homes and more likely to live in multifamily homes where you have less energy that's used to heat, because the more exterior walls you have, the more, the bigger your carbon footprint. So sort of across everything, they just consume less, and that's the primary reason.
So Joanne had a question. This was directed to Max. How does the poverty reduction from carbon fee and dividend compare to other recent measures like stimulus payments and the child tax credit?
Yeah, the child tax credit was anticipated to reduce poverty by 40%, child poverty by 40%. So that's a similar order of magnitude to the child poverty impact. I think it's maybe 20% from a fully phased in carbon dividend. But in the first year, certainly the child tax credit would be a much bigger impact immediately. On the other hand, there are some reasons to believe that some of those analyses may overstate the impact of, for example, the child tax credit. One of the reasons is it's really hard to reach non-filers. When you're doing things through the tax code, it's something like half of poor children, children below the poverty line, are in households that don't file taxes. So they have to submit a special form and be reminded in special ways to fill out taxes, even though they don't really have to, so that they can get the benefit. And this was a real difficulty for the White House in terms of executing on their goal. The carbon dividend would not have that problem. It would probably be delivered through the Social Security Administration, which has hundreds of offices across the country. It delivers tons of checks every month. It is a really well-oiled machine for identifying who's eligible, like basically who's a person in the country, and giving them money. So to the extent that if you're looking for a sustainable anti-poverty solution that reaches all age groups, I think the child tax credit may have cut overall poverty around 10%, compared to child poverty about 40%. This is definitely in the ballpark.
And I just want to add on that the missing millions of children that are living in poverty that did not benefit from the child tax credit, it's not just typically the situations that you may think of when Max says that they don't live with a tax filer. You're talking a lot about, it's not even so much children of undocumented people, but children in foster care, right? A lot of them don't have a person who would claim them as a dependent, so they don't benefit. Nobody, they don't have a household, so their household doesn't benefit. Children whose families earn income from sources outside the United States. We know somebody, a good friend of ours, who struggled to get not just child tax credit, but his stimulus. He's an American. There was no issues like that, but his earnings were coming from outside the country. So I just want to kind of maybe put kind of elucidate on that aspect of it. I'm going to go to the next question from Melissa, and she asked, any chance the other bills would be condensed into this one to further solidify support? And I guess it's to both of you or either.
Yeah, so I'm guessing this refers to the other carbon pricing bills. I think they have a lot of co-sponsors who are common, so it might not, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm looking at the chat, so let me know. So I'm not sure it would increase the support too much, except for this fact that some of them are in the Senate. So there is no EICDA version in the Senate yet. That's a real big goal for us in the next year to make that happen. There may also, I do see another question around the bipartisan support. And, Mitt Romney is a firm supporter of carbon pricing. And I'm not sure if he would sign on to the EICDA yet. He'd sort of be out on his own. But you could imagine a Republican bill and then some sort of reconciliation package or something like the infrastructure bill that brings those visions together. Because ultimately, there's different kinds of phrasings of this. On the left, you're talking about corporate polluter fees, and it's true, it shouldn't be free to pollute. On the right, it's about having market-oriented solutions to a problem that lots of Republican constituents, especially the younger folks, are recognizing as a major issue.
Max, thank you. I have my own question, and then I think there might be a couple more questions in the chat. Why is a dividend of the profits better being, directed back to the American people as opposed to going towards some sort of government program?
Yeah, I think this is, our goal is really to make sure that we cut pollution, cut carbon emissions, and carbon pricing is the most effective way. Everyone believes that. I mean, the IPCC just had, I think, 500 mentions of carbon pricing in their latest report, which came out last week. And then all the economists, all the climate scientists who really know that this is what we need to do. And conditional on that, you have a question is how you make low-income people whole, because it is going to, some of that carbon price is going to filter down into low-income folks who pay more for goods and services. So if you don't help them out with something direct, you're going to increase the poverty rate potentially, maybe even increase inequality. So direct cash assistance is really I think a promising path to doing that, especially like energy R&D is a great thing. Personally, I think we need more of it. But if we put all of the money into energy R&D, that is pretty unlikely to offset the poverty impacts of effectively a tax on high carbon goods and services.
Yeah, I think just kind of adding to that, giving it back to people also gives them a lot of flexibility on what they want to spend the money on. For some people, that money is going to go towards, basic cost of living and that kind of thing. And other people can find other things to do with that money. And I think another thing too is, the administration costs, I think, have been estimated at about 2% of the total fees. So that kind of slims down that spending as well, getting more of that money directly to people.
And I think that 2% is mostly on the carbon pricing collection side. The actual distribution would be pretty cheap because the Social Security Administration, it would just kind of go to them and they're doing it already.
Thank you both. So another question from Dara. What's been the response by energy companies? Are they fighting this tooth and nail, or are there some who are on board and championing the policy?
There's some support. I mean, certainly, clean energy companies, I think, are on board. Again, I encourage you to go to energyinnovationact.org, where there's endorsements page from businesses and nonprofits and lots of different groups. There is also an argument for them that has resonated. For example, the Climate Leadership Council is another pro-carbon dividend group that has had support from energy companies, even fossil fuel companies. And the idea there is you can weigh two different approaches to dealing with the climate crisis. One is very uncertain regulations that sort of every presidential cycle, you might have to redo your whole business to comply with, compared to a very straightforward pricing regime. That was at least their argument. There also, ExxonMobil, for example, there was a lobbyist who sort of said, oh, we were just saying that we want carbon pricing because we don't think it actually pass and it just makes us look good. So there's reason to be very cynical, as always, with fossil fuel companies. And ultimately, this is a very severe tax on them. It would definitely reduce their profitability in major ways. So, but it can be sort of good for everyone involved compared to very top-down command and control approaches.
All right. I got a question for Mariah. I like this question. Is this too wonky for the younger folks? Can they get excited about it? If so, what's the best approach? Converting into actions like this.
Yeah, I think that is a toughie, because I think you have a lot of really motivated and even mobilized young people, particularly in Gen Z. They're a lot more engaged than I know I was at that age as a millennial. I think it might be a little bit of a tougher sell at first, because this bill does, it's not as sexy, I guess. It's more, there's more compromise. It's less it's still a very like wide sweeping, impressive bill, but I think maybe the marketing isn't as exciting to young people who want to see revolution happen, versus something a little more mundane. So I think it's about how we message it, and I think it's about how I think just being able to come together and make some compromises on some things to be able to get some things done, because right now we're just not getting anything done. So that's kind of my take on it. But yeah, hop in if anyone has any other thoughts on that.
I'll just add, I'm an old guy, I've got gray beard and stuff, but I think this can be a really sexy policy, and that we are making polluters pay. I mean, what's more sort of populist than that in some ways, if you're like just fed up with all the profits that fossil fuel companies enjoy. And then cash transfers have had their moment in the past few years, especially. So giving money directly to people is, I think, very popular. The only thing, in my view, that would make it a little bit milquetoast is that it's not aggressive enough. The starting, we're not making them pay enough. We're not giving people enough money. But that's something we can change if we have, especially activism from young people who are very powerful in today's political climate. So please help.
Yeah. So I have another question. I have a couple if we have time, but I don't want to hog people's time. So one question I have is, why give it the same amount to everyone, regardless of their income?
I think you know the answer to that, Marina, but
it's a ringer. I'm so superficial and transparent.
I'll give it a shot. Yeah, I think there's some philosophical reasons, and there are technical reasons, and there are like economic reasons. So a philosophical reason is climate change is something that affects all of us. And to the extent that we are allowing fossil fuel companies to damage our environment, we should all be compensated for that damage. That's how I view it. And so a more technical reason is something we sort of talked about before, which is the effect of income taxation. If you're trying to do this through tax credits or the tax system, it's just going to be very hard to reach everybody. And even if it's a fully refundable tax credit that hits everybody except the top 5% or something like that, that still means you can't do it through the Social Security Administration realistically. It probably can't be done monthly because you're having to forecast what people's income is going to be throughout the year. In January, you're going to have to give them a monthly payment, which is 12 or whatever the annual amount that they'd be eligible for based on their annual income at the end of the year divided by 12. That's just a very hard problem. It's actually like an impossible problem because you can't go back in time. You can't move forward in time. So you're going to have a situation where people are having to repay their overpayments, or they're not going to get the amount that they should be eligible for because we just don't know what their earnings are going to be by the end of the year. And I think there's an economic argument too, which is means testing. If you were to give it to everyone except the rich, let's say, or even just giving it to the bottom half of Americans, that's a tax. It's actually a tax on labor income, right? Because you're saying, okay, the more you work, the less money you get from this benefit program. That's the same as saying the more you work, the more you're going to pay in income taxes. So the technical term is this would increase marginal tax rates, and therefore it would actually reduce labor supply. So this is why actually, if you look at a lot of the economic papers on optimal taxation, what you want to do is minimize marginal tax rates as the amount of an extra dollar you earn that you pay in taxes or lost benefits, and then also sort of maximize the effective tax rate. And the solution to that problem in many of these papers is to have a high tax rate and then a high flat benefit amount instead of having the benefit phase out with income. So those are some of the reasons. TBD, I think folks have also said this could be more politically persuasive. The public opinion sentiment, if you look at polls, is not super conclusive on that matter. But I think you'll see in Canada, for example, they are actually going to do this dividend for the first time. We'll get to see the impact of that. The Alaska Permanent Fund dividend is very popular among Alaskans. And there's actually some polls saying they do not want that to be means tested. They want it to go to everyone. So I think there's some of a, we just need to get our foot in the door, and people are then going to realize the impact of having something that's truly universal, and that we all are in this together, and then it's going to snowball from there. Anything
Very
you'd
well
add,
said.
Marina, or other UBI folks? Yeah.
I think that you said it. Yeah, you said it all there. I don't think that there was anything else. Any closing remarks from either of you? I think that we're about down to time. I want to say thank you while I still have a mic up. Oh, hold on. I don't want to. I'm going to read this. This is from Rob. Some of the acceptance problem by other countries' citizens that currently have CFD is that many citizens aren't really aware there's a rebate, since it may be applied to the annual tax rate or healthcare insurance reductions. So he's saying it's a benefit that you don't really see, which ends up really not being a benefit. He finishes, the monthly rebates keep the money in the economy and actually can grow the economy more effectively.
Yeah, this is the case in Canada for sure. That so far there have been, I think some provinces have started with just putting the money into your energy bill or your tax bill. So it's not really prominent. And California does the same thing, actually. We do have a carbon pricing system. The revenue from that goes into your energy bill once a year. Most people don't even realize that it's there. So, but Canada is actually going to start making it a true dividend. I don't know, maybe next year or something like that, pretty soon. And I'm sure we'll see a lot of really interesting political science research coming out of that. Again, I think the fact that the stimulus checks were very salient, the Alaska Permanent Dividend is very salient. Those were both like really popular policies. I think you'll see the same kinds of effects. And also, I just mentioned that, I don't know if I don't remember if Mariah mentioned this, but the US is one of only 2 developed countries that does not price carbon right now. The US and Australia, that's it. And Australia actually used to, and then they didn't like some of the way it was designed, so they axed it. But every other country, including like China, I mean, lots of countries are doing carbon pricing. So there's lots of ways that we can learn from what other countries are doing. I'll leave that as my last remarks, maybe. I think I've spoken plenty, but yeah, so thank you all again, unless there was another question.
So we'll get to this next question, but so everybody knows what we're looking at. I just wanted to show the results of the ranked vote that you guys did. So by significant margin, look at this. This was one round. So if this was an election, then health risks due to increase in frequency and intensity would have won in the primary as far as what people consider to be the most pressing issue when it comes to climate change. So that's very interesting. And I would not have predicted that. If anybody chose that and wanted to speak on why they thought that was so important, I would love to hear about that also. And there was another question, I think. Maybe not. Maybe not. All right, that's it. If Max, are the links to your websites for PolicyEngine and UBI Center, is that in your doc for the slides?
I think they are, but I'll drop them in the chat as well.
Yeah, that's a good idea, just in case people want to keep tabs on that. Thank you. Yeah, city council races currently are our Las Vegas city council races, and all of our city council races currently operate on a final 5 first to 51 nonpartisan election cycle. So
Still there, Marina?
we are, yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to read. I'm a slow reader. Rob, I think that we will be able to make the minutes of the recording available, and the chat should be included in that too. So hopefully we can get that to you later. No worries, no worries. All right, you guys, if that wraps it up. Oh, is that you, Max?
Oh, sorry, I wasn't sure if Mariah wanted to give any last words, and I might steal like 2 final words as well at the end. If that's all right.
Yeah, sure. Just quick mention. Joanne just dropped these links in the chat. If you're feeling fired up about climate change and you want to do something, there's a link in there to write your Congress members on ccl.org. So I definitely recommend you do that. It will walk you through the entire process. You don't even need to know who your representative is. And then you can just kind of customize your message and let them know what you think. And then the other thing really quickly is if you are in Las Vegas and you want to do some Earth Day celebrations, CCL is going to be at the Springs Preserve on April 24th. And it's going to be a fun little shindig with some other organizations along with CCL. Untitled is going to be there, and we're going to talk about climate solutions. So that link is also in the chat.
And I just wanted to say, I know Cesar had a question, what's stopping this from happening? And yeah, it really is just, I think Citizens Climate Lobby is an incredible organization. I've been part of a number of advocacy groups And I think they're one of the most organized. You were mentioning city council races. We're trying to get law endorsements from every level of government, from every kind of person who has power in this country to push Congress to make polluters pay and give the money back to the people. So really would encourage you to get involved. I've found it extremely rewarding, and that it really is it. That's all that's stopping it from happening. So thanks for holding the event.
Yeah, thank you.
For sure. And surprisingly, you would say that. Move Nevada Forward's friend, Erica Smith, Dr. Erica is here today, and she's running for Las Vegas City Council, Ward 2. Is that right, Erica? Yes, Ward 2. And she's been a friend of ours for a while. She's participated in income movement events with us. She's dropped her website in the chat too, if for any of you local people who are interested, or even if you're not local but you're still interested, that's cool. So yeah, very, very nice. I'm so glad that we had this. I don't want to keep people, I know, you know, Friday nights for people who are not boring, you know, things happen. But I want to say thanks to Max and Mariah. This was wonderful. I'm so grateful that this worked out. Joanne, and like everybody here, Alonzo, Dara, Erica, like Caesar, I'm just so happy that you guys came out. So I'm going to go ahead and end the recording and end this webinar, but I can hang out for another little while and we can maybe make this a little bit more casual. But if that's all, I'm logging off. Thank you guys.